It was a dark and stormy night when suddenly a uxwbill video started playing. Hello there everyone, you have, as previously suggested, tuned in uxwbill, and on tonight's video we're going to be discussing this Compaq LTE Lite 25 model laptop computer. This is something that came from the land of Kentucky. Some years ago I ventured down there after a load of IBM Personal System 2 computer equipment, and this followed me home along with its docking station. Now, back at the time when I had just brought this machine home, I did think to try it out inside the docking station since I had no other power source for it. I think we're just about to lose power here, folks. So, while we've still got some lights, I guess I'll go ahead and turn that back on and get back to the story here for as long as I can, but we may have to reconvene because this is as it happens video making, folks. Anyway, I got the docking station with this machine, shoved it in there, tried it out, discovered that it was completely lifeless and non-functional, which at the time I ascribed to being a fault with the docking station itself and not the computer. Now that I've gotten everything set up and the worst of the storm seems to have passed us by and the lights haven't flickered ominously for about 5 minutes now, let's go ahead and take a look at what the laptop buyer of the early 1990s would have gotten if they would have purchased a Compaq LTE Lite series computer. One of the first things I'd like to do to this poor thing, just because it's been camped out in the Roach Palace for so long, I'd like to go ahead and try to clean it up a little bit here. This is just run-of-the-mill glass cleaner, and it might not be the best idea. In fact, it's usually not the greatest idea to squirt that right on the machine itself. But I figure we'll probably get away with it because there's no obvious cracks or anything through which it could seep into the computer's liquid crystal display screen. So there we go. Now we've got it looking a little bit more presentable, although it won't look very presentable when we look at the other sides of it for reasons I'll get to in just a moment. Let's go ahead and take a look at the front end of the computer. Right here you can see that although there isn't a whole lot to look at, there are a few things that we will see along the way. First of all, there's a removable battery that is almost certainly long since dead by now. In fact, I took a look at that just a couple of minutes ago prior to making this video, and I discovered that it looks to have started to corrode, which in addition to being something that I would likely blame on the humidity in the Roach Palace, is probably also something that we can just attribute to time and wear finally getting even with the poor battery inside this computer. Fortunately, it hasn't corroded so badly that it appears to have ruined anything, at least not anything that would be internal to the computer. We have an activity lamp for the hard drive, and then over here we have what was once a very common staple of computers, and again, a comment that I truthfully made more in jest than anything else, that real computers have floppy drives. So if you take that comment particularly seriously, then I guess this qualifies as a real computer to you, because it most definitely does have a floppy drive. Now, if we zoom in a little bit and take a closer look at the front of the machine here near the floppy drive, you can see that there's some discoloration. This is one of the many lovely things that happens to older computers, especially older computers that live in a somewhat humid environment. The rubber actually starts to break down on these machines, and this one is no exception to the rule. As we can see here, if we adjust the tripod just a little bit, hopefully without making too much noise and killing all the headphone users who are watching this, the rubber feet on this computer have long since degraded. In fact, just tonight, I scraped off their remains over a trash can in the kitchen, and I tried to clean them up as best I could with a paper towel that was slightly moistened with water. But there's still a lot of residue here. This would probably be a job for Goo Gone if I really wanted to get it removed completely. But I'm going to hold off on that until I have actually seen this computer start to operate, because if it doesn't work correctly, there's really not much point in cleaning it up. Here on the bottom of the machine, we have the informational label, which tells us a lot of very interesting things that are also good to know. This is a product of Compaq Computer Corporation. May they rest in peace. I really was disgusted when Hewlett-Packard bought them. It was the end of a very good company, in my opinion, and something you definitely wouldn't see anymore on most any laptop computer. This is, in fact, a product of the United States of America. It was probably assembled with globally sourced parts. And speaking of assembly, Compaq was actually fairly unique in that they built their own laptops for a very long time, at least up until the LTE 5000 series, which were manufactured for them by Inventa Computer. But prior to that, Compaq stood almost completely alone by manufacturing their own laptops, either here in the United States or later in Singapore, as was the case with the Contura 386 and 486 series. Looking elsewhere on the bottom of the machine, we see the various certifications, safety certifications and otherwise, UL, CSA, Nemco, I think, not real sure, TUV Rhineland out of Germany, and of course many other various marks whose meaning I probably know, but can't readily call to mind. And so instead of embarrassing myself here on video any more than I already have, well, the enterprising soul can look those up in Google, or they can take a great deal of delight and post in the comments that someone is wrong in a YouTube video. As hard as that would be to believe, sometimes it does happen, even to the best of us. Those of us that are actually human, you know. Here we have a recycling notice for the nickel-cadmium battery. That should almost certainly be recycled at this point. And then we'll turn our attentions to the side of the computer. Go ahead and zoom out the camcorder here so we can have a closer look at the sides. We have a latch with which to open the display. Still works very, very well. And then we have a telephone modem. Now, I would imagine this is no more than probably 2400 or 9600 bits per second. And one thing that's very important to remember when you're referring to faster modem speeds, although it's hard to believe that at one time 2400 bits per second was fast, the term baud versus bits per second, their meanings diverge after the 1200 bit per second or so mark. Basically, it has to do with increased efficiency in data coding and transmission techniques. And if you want to know more about that, you can look it up online. As previously mentioned, this machine came to me with its docking station, which unfortunately did not work. I have simply left this open primarily because this little door happens to be thoroughly stuck and I'd rather not break it. But if we flip down the back door on this machine, again making sure not to break it, the rest of the ports come out to meet us. We have a 9-pin serial port, a printer port. The serial number for the machine is printed up here. We have a VGA output that rather curiously, if you look very carefully at this, you'll see that it's mounted upside down. Now some of you will think, oh, that's not very weird at all. If you remember AGP graphics cards, and I think that many of you certainly do, upside down VGA output connectors weren't very odd on those. But to people like me who have been at this for a while, seeing an upside down VGA connector on an AGP card or even this computer, well, it definitely throws a guy for a bit of a loop, especially since the other ports are installed in their normal upright orientation, including presumably the docking station connector. This small headphone-style jack right here is for a numeric keypad. Yes, apparently at the time, a lot of laptop manufacturers like to do things their own way, and one of those things sometimes involved the connection of their accessories. So Compaq had to play a little bit fast and loose with that. At one point in time, I actually did have a numeric keypad for these computers, but I think it got washed away in the Great Basement Flood of 2004, and that it is no longer a thing in my collection. And as proof that this is video making as it happens, folks, take a look at that PS2 connector. That connector actually has dual functionality in the case of this and many other laptops. It supports both a keyboard and a mouse, although you would need a splitter to make proper use of it. And at one time, when this computer was new, it likely included that splitter or allowed you to send off for it at very little to no additional cost. IBM's ThinkPads did the same thing for many years before PS2 connections vanished entirely from almost any computer you could buy, and IBM usually did include the adapter in the box with the computer. And then the fun one. This is the power connector. Take a look at that little beauty. What is it with equipment manufacturers and power connectors that they have to engage in proprietary shenanigans? That's part of the reason why I just let this machine sit and never tried to do anything with it, because who knows if I could even get my hands on a power supply. I probably could. I'm sure there's some on eBay right now, in fact, but I am a professional internet lazy butt, as many of you probably already know. So that concludes our look at the ports on the back of this computer. Let's go ahead and see what's on the other side here. It's really not very exciting. But right over here is a ubiquitous connector. Some things about technology change very rapidly, and others do not. Let's go ahead and zoom in on that, take a closer look at it. And if we do, as soon as the camera comes into focus, you'll see that it has a chain pictograph on it. So what could that possibly be for? Well, if you've been around computers at all, you know that that is a Kensington lock connector. It is probably one of the closest things to a universal standard in computing across many different platforms that there ever could have been. I noticed, however, that there's no obvious place to actually connect a Kensington lock. I don't know if you're supposed to take this little plastic piece out, or what might be involved in actually making use of that. You'll also notice that there appears to be a groove cut into the plastic here, indicating that this is perhaps a separate assembly, something that's intended to come out of there. Maybe it's a hard drive, I don't know for certain. Could also be for memory expansion, motherboard removal, math coprocessor installation. Really hard to tell for sure, and I don't see any obvious way of opening it. Plus, I have no real need to open it, so I'm not going to worry about whatever is behind there. Again, before people go too crazy in the comments, I have located the service manual for this machine online, so if I decide to get really motivated as to what's behind that panel or how the Kensington lock port is actually intended to be used on this computer, I assure you I'm eminently capable of discovering and utilizing that information. And then we're brought around back to the front of the machine again, which hasn't changed since the last time we looked at it. This thing is, outside of being a little bit grungy, mainly from melted rubber foot disease, in surprisingly good condition, but it does appear that it's had a little bit of action here around the battery, and I think it's probably been like that during all of the time that I've had it. So we'll set it down here, make sure the camcorder is completely zoomed out, adjust our tripod down a little bit. This is, of course, the finest, cheapest tripod that money could buy. It was $10 at my local junk store, and I assure you it was worth every penny. Such are the high standards around here. As was common for laptops of the early 1990s, most of them did not include a pointing device simply because many people weren't using software that required the use of a pointing device. Now, there were a couple laptops of the time. In fact, the series that came after this, the Compaq LTE Lite series, pay attention, that's a careful distinction between LTE Lite and LTE Elite. You may find some confusion if you decide to look up these machines on the internet. The LTE Elite series actually added a trackball in the lower corner of the screen over here, along with a set of click buttons. And if you're thinking, that sounds weird, you are absolutely right. It is a little bit unusual. But back then, every laptop manufacturer was doing their own thing as concerned how to use a mouse with their machines, or what kind of built-in pointing device they actually cared to supply. Things have calmed down to the point now where we pretty much have only touchpads and pointing sticks as the two survivors. But at one point there were clip-on trackballs, there were special laptop-style mice. IBM even marketed a special convertible mouse that went between a trackball and a mouse for their L40SX laptop computer. I have a video about that. If you'd like to go and see it, you can search my channel for IBM L40SX pointing device or similar, and it certainly should come up. But since there is no pointing device, we have a lot of room devoted to the keyboard. This is, of course, unavoidably smaller than a regular keyboard, and it doesn't really offer much in the way of tactile, not tactical. That's a very different matter entirely. This does not offer much in the way of tactile feedback, but as laptop keyboards go, you can tell there is some sound that's produced when you hit a key. It's a little bit on the soft side. I would tell you that the IBM PS2 L40's keyboard is better, though it too is certainly no Model M or similar high-quality tactile keyboard. But this is by far and away a million times better than the rubber dome mush boards of the time, even with the compromises it has to make to offer full-fledged functionality. Some of those compromises include providing keys with more than one function. If we zoom in carefully here on some of the top row keys, I'll get it right sooner or later, I promise. And I apologize once again to my headphone users out there. If we take a look at these keys, you can see that they have functionality printed on them in light blue, kind of a teal or cyan colored type. Those keys actually have double functions. If you push them and no other key at any given time, the function that is printed at the top of the key is what will be performed. For example, page up. But if we go over to the other side of the keyboard at the extreme lower left, the last key that you can hit right underneath Shift and Caps Lock and sitting to the left of the left-hand control key, there is a so-called function key. This is something you'll still see on laptops from time to time. Again, it's one of those things that hasn't changed a lot, even though technology like Rust absolutely never sleeps. If you want to perform the secondary function of any of these keys that happen to have one, all you have to do is hold down the function key, which I'll pretend you can actually see me doing. If you can't see it, you can certainly hear it. And so you can take my word for it that I am actually hitting that key when I go to hit any of these other keys. And so, for example, the page up key, when pressed with the function key depressed, turns into the pause button. Now, of course, the pause button is not of much interest to anyone who is operating in a modern operating system. It's traditionally only used by older programs and under the MS-DOS operating system, or anything similar. Perhaps it does indeed pause the flow of text or program execution on a Linux or Unix style or BSD system. I really don't know, because believe it or not, I've never actually pressed it there to see what happens. But if it does work that way, well, you can take a great deal of delight in saying that you know something uxwbill hasn't yet found out. So, all right, we've had a pretty good overview of the hardware on this machine. That really only leaves one very exciting subject, and that is the matter of the display. Now, back in the bad old days of laptops like this one, you would not find a color display very often. In fact, for a while, the technology simply wasn't available. By the time this particular machine was manufactured, color display technology existed. But it was all of fiddly and extremely, frighteningly expensive, so most people simply got along without it. Your humble video maker included. Yes, back in the day, folks, I had a Compaq Contura 4/25, a machine that Compaq offered with a color display, but like most of the other common people at the time, I certainly didn't have the means by which to afford such a display, so I simply did all my computing in grayscale, which really wasn't a big deal. I didn't have any trouble with that until the day that I decided to hook up the color monitor from my desktop and work on all the projects that I'd been doing in the print shop. I think some of you can probably see where this is going and can imagine what happened. What I'd been doing when I worked on the computer's internal panel display was choosing shades of gray that looked great. I didn't realize, though, especially since I didn't have the VGA color palette and its arrangement within Microsoft Windows and Windows software memorized, that I was making absolutely ridiculous, sometimes quite conflicting color choices. But for the most part, like I say, we got along pretty well with these monochrome screens on our laptops. Now, most of these monochrome screens were of what is referred to as a dual scan nature. And there is another problem that plagues dual scan displays, whether they are color or monochrome in nature, and that is motion blurring. Motion blurring makes it very possible for two unfortunate possibilities to take place. The first of which is the loss of your mouse pointer. The display simply doesn't respond fast enough, the mouse pointer kind of ghosts into non-existence, and you can't find it. If any of you have ever wondered why I use a big mouse pointer on my desktop machines, even though there's very little practical reason to do so in this modern world, well, it's just a holdover. Old habits, they truly do die hard in some cases. The other problem with dual scan display screens is that of playing computer games on them. Most computer games exhibit such horrible motion blurring that they are a lot less enjoyable to play on a laptop. That's certainly not to say that it's impossible. Back when I carried my Compaq LTE 5000 and its dual scan color display on a regular basis, the first time I ever beat The Secret of Monkey Island, an MS-DOS-based game, I did so while sitting in a Chrysler dealership waiting for the Black Plague van to be fixed. Yes, the motion blur was a problem, but it was not an insurmountable problem, especially given the convenience of being able to finish a computer game in a Chrysler dealership. What an idea! That's probably not why laptop computers were invented, but that day I thought it was a great reason for their existence. So let's go ahead, before I get too carried away with this thing, just because this battery might cause problems, let's go ahead and pop it out. I did this off camera and it looked so easy, so now when I try to do it on camera, it's naturally not going to work. I push this thing in, And the battery did come out once, but now it looks like it's being stubborn. So I guess I'll have to deal with that. Come on. This is As It Happens video making, folks. You've got to push it in or the button won't go down to let you get it out. There we go. Here's a look at the battery. The original would have been made of nickel cadmium, but cadmium is toxic, and so production of nickel cadmium batteries was being phased out at the time this particular computer would have been manufactured. The nickel metal hydride battery was undoubtedly offered as an upgrade, and in addition to being an upgrade that I sprung for myself back in the days of my Compaq Contura, it looks like the previous owner of this machine decided to spring for it as well. Now, if we take a very close look at this, I'll have to turn the camera light back on here. You can definitely see that there is some green-colored corrosion. Luckily, it does not seem to have followed anything into the computer. Now that I've talked your ear off about this computer and regaled you with some undoubtedly stupid anecdotes along the way, I think it's high time we went ahead and powered this machine up just to see what, if anything, it might do. But as you've probably guessed, I don't actually have a power adapter for this computer. So I'm going to have to resort to something a little bit interesting. Extraordinarily dangerous, dubious, and shaky are probably not even the beginning as far as words that would be appropriate to describe this particular setup are concerned. I went ahead and found the power pinout information online. I presume that it is correct. We'll find out a little bit later if we actually let the magic smoke out of something. We've talked a lot about smoke tests lately. Again, one of those things that I started doing as a joke, but some people have really come to expect it. So I guess I feel that I can't let my public down. You'll notice that this says the computer draws 18.5 volts at 2.8 amps. There's only one thing I have to my name that could even come close to generating that kind of voltage at the necessary current, and that would be this regulated 5 amp DC power supply. And I know for a fact that this thing, especially at the higher voltage settings, cannot necessarily make its nameplate rating, but it was still pretty good value for the money. I've been very happy with it, even though it is a pretty cheap Chinese device, and I would even recommend it to anyone who is looking for a variable regulated power supply because they are handy. It's kind of like variacs or variable auto transformers. You can't ever have too many of these things. What I've done here, I've taken a set of meter leads and jammed them into the machine's connector. Because like I say, if it doesn't work, there's really not going to be any sense in buying a proper power supply for it. And initially I thought I might actually have to go to the trouble of using alligator clips to get this hooked up, but it appears that the meter leads fit very nicely on the terminals of the power supply itself. And in what had to be something of a serendipitous occasion, which is most definitely your word for the day, both serendipitous and occasion if you want to have a bonus round, I turned this on before I hooked anything up and discovered that it's set to output about 18.5 volts. So it really doesn't get any much more perfect than that. I am glad that these fit on here because these are not very heavy wires, these alligator clips. And while these things are handier than a pocket on a shirt, well, they have limits over as concerns how much current can be safely delivered over them. These came from Hazard Fraught Tools. And I strongly believe that they are rated only for 1 amp worth of current delivery. That's not to say I haven't overloaded them before, sometimes quite baroquely, in fact, and gotten away with it. Now, if ever you're faced with a similar problem as concerns powering a laptop that you're not sure whether or not it works and you don't want to spend any money on it, you do have some options. You could do something like this, or you could even take your battery, make a note of its operating voltage, as well as its polarity, which is frequently indicated on the body of the battery itself, where it may not in fact be indicated on the computer. And you could fake out the unit with this. If we find that this doesn't work, we may have to involve these guys anyway. I really don't know that I'm enough of a twiddle fingers. I mean, I got kind of a big paw. It's not going to go in there very easily. And even with my best needle nose pliers to hand, might have to duct tape several of those together just to get something long enough to make it all the way into the back of the computer. But in any case, whenever you're doing something like this, it is definitely a risk. You do run the risk of blowing up the computer or whatever it is you're trying to power, especially if it's not protected against reverse polarity. And a lot of devices, all too many of them, are frequently not protected against reversed polarity. But I believe that this diagram is correct, so we're going to try this. Got to screw up my courage, hold my breath, and say, smoke test! Okay, well, there's no smoke, no fire yet. We'll need to dial in a little more of a current limit here, because I don't know how much this machine will actually draw. We'll get that up a little bit closer to its actual rating. Again, a lot of modern laptops run from about 19 volts, and there's a reason for that, because they all have what's called a DC to DC converter inside them that serves to derive all the operating voltages that the average computer would need, such as 5, 12, 3.3, so on and so forth. Let's go ahead and turn this off so we don't have a huge glare on the monitor, although that makes the FS200 get a little ghosty. And let's just see if this thing will power up. But it's not looking good, folks. Not registering any current draw or anything. So I'm thinking that either I'm not making good contact, my pinout's not as good as I thought it was, but I haven't smoked anything, or this poor computer has a problem with its power input, and maybe the docking station was fine all along. Who knows? I really don't look forward to trying hooking these things up. That's going to be a pain. But I guess I'll have to play around with it a little bit and see if I can get it to do anything interesting for you. I do hope that all of you who are watching this appreciate the links to which I go to make these things happen for all of you out there in YouTube land. I did manage to get those leads hooked up to the battery compartment, and as long as the polarity notation on the battery itself happens to be correct, well, it should have powered up, and unfortunately it is still completely dead to the world. Doesn't try to do anything. No smoke, no lights flashing, no nothing. And at this point, I think there are a couple of different possibilities. First of all, I just call it a loss, acknowledge that it's shuffled off this mortal coil and hopefully gone to a more pleasant plane of existence at this point. Maybe someone subjected this machine to power supply experimentation at some time in the past, and they fried something, although usually that smell hangs around for a very, very long time just to remind you of the stupid thing that you've done. Or perhaps this system's CMOS battery is completely depleted and it's got to be good in order for this thing's power-on logic to work. I have seen a couple of machines like that. So I might go ahead and consult the service manual at some point in the future for this particular machine. But at this point, that's where it stands right now for the Compaq LTE Elite /25. Not all of my videos have a happy ending, and unfortunately this one didn't. At least not yet. But the story's not quite over. As far as a microprocessor within this machine is concerned, I'll take a guess based on its age that it's probably a 386 of some description. Although with it being clocked at 25 megahertz, there is the possibility of its being a very early production 486 system. But as always, folks, thank you for watching. I hope you stuck it out with me this long. If you have, by all means, certainly do feel free to leave a comment if you have one. Oh, well, I'm sure that many of you folks out there knew this was coming. Yes, indeed, this is the postscript to the video, long after I'd said that it ended. Not only did I decide that I wanted my clip leads back, which it looks like I'm going to have to go inside to retrieve them because I can't get a grip on them with the pliers, I also just can't leave anything alone. And unfortunately, I think I have discovered signs of foul play inside this laptop. Stuff that I don't think happened while it was under my watch. Because you can say a lot of things about the Roach Palace, but at least in the primary house where this machine was stored, the roof definitely doesn't leak. But we have one heavily corroded screw there. We have corrosion here on this shield. There's more corrosion over here. Maybe this machine had a drink at some point in its lifetime, but unfortunately I think at this point it is probably a former laptop computer. I did find something kind of cool in here though. Take a look at how that display flex cable has been wrapped around that hinge. I thought that was really neat looking. Not to mention the way they ran the ground braid through it. There's way more display cable there than it would ever need. But I guess that was just good design on the part of Compaq. to try and keep as much strain as is possible off of that connector and cable. So I'll take this thing a little bit further apart, but I think we've already found the reason why it doesn't work. Oh yeah, something horrible definitely happened to this computer. There's corrosion all over the terminals for the hard drive. Connor hard drive. Don't know if that's any good still or not. I guess I'd be kind of surprised. Corrosion all over its mating connector. And the deeper I go, the worse and worse it seems to get. This is kind of an interesting thing. We have the hard drive cable here, and then at the end we have the system speaker. And this is how things used to be before the system speaker was demoted to a little piezoelectric squeaker can, or even omitted entirely. Not to mention, this is a really nifty translucent printed circuit assembly. There's the cable coming into it, and then the cable is simply mated up with some sort of reinforcing fiber or plastic of some kind to give it its strength. Definitely kind of a neat little assembly there. Cool thing to look at. Even if this poor laptop is toast, and unfortunately, yes, that is a screw that I had to get violent with because it was so badly corroded that all it would do was sit and turn in its socket. I guess the corrosion came not from the battery leaking, but from whatever assaulted this poor machine earlier in its life. There are a couple things that ought to be worth saving. Floppy drive is probably still good. It seems to have been spared exposure to whatever it was that got this poor thing. And no, as a rule, I do not sell or trade computer parts on YouTube. I realize there are some of you that are looking at this and saying, I desperately need Compaq LTE Lite series parts. Please don't ask, because the answer is going to be no. I'll keep these parts for my own collection in case I come across another one of these at some point that needs a repair with a part that's still good from this machine, like the display or the casing or something along those lines. I'm going to go ahead and see if I can get this shield off, but I think I already know everything I need to know here. That whatever happened to this thing was truly and incredibly unfortunate. Now we're looking at the system's logic board, probably the chipset right there. There's definitely a fair bit of corrosion damage around there. I found the CMOS and standby backup battery. It too is extremely heavily corroded. Just a bad deal the whole way around. I went to lift up this cable for the hard drive, and it just fell apart. First the little pull tab strap came off, and then when that came off the cable started to come up, but the connector just broke into pieces. It was so badly corroded. Here's the little modem that came out of the computer. We'll look a little bit more at that in a moment. I wanted to take a moment and spotlight the little expansion bay that it came out of. It's actually intended to be removable. Presumably there might have been some other peripherals that could be installed here. Sort of a forerunner to PC card or PCM-CIA slots, which certainly would have existed even if only in their infancy when this machine was manufactured, but Compaq apparently decided not to integrate them. Speaking of Compaq, I wonder what this thing is down here that's partially hidden by this metal shield that bears their logo. Maybe it's some hidden service information or something? I don't know. Now, as promised, let's go ahead and take a closer look at the modem. If we take a close look at this, you can see that the board is identified as being a modem. There's a 1990 copyright from Compaq Computer. This comes from a different time, folks, a time when even if the computer company in question didn't actually manufacture the finished product, they had a significant amount, if not the entire amount, of input into designing and laying out the circuitry. One thing I noticed about this when I was looking at it, there's a high diversity of parts on here. They all appear to be house numbered. I haven't had any luck looking up data sheets for any of these things. that start with this 73D number. Probably some sort of a proprietary numbering scheme. The only standardized parts that I see on the thing are these two Mitsubishi electric memory chips, this Samsung memory chip, and that's it. I would assume this large chip is probably the modem's data pump. That is to say, the encoding logic that actually takes the incoming data and converts it into tones that it then sings over the telephone line. This large chip up here, in keeping with a lot of modems of this particular time frame, based on the Intel copyrights of 1980 and 82, I would say that is probably an 8051 series microcontroller, but it's hard to tell for sure. Again, this was long before the age of software-defined WIN modems and stuff like that. You have a transformer that probably serves as isolation between the computer's circuitry and the phone line. And then this component marked as being manufactured by NEC is the hook switch relay. The modem would also drive this relay very rapidly for those who are using it in a pulse dialing environment. Of course, tone dialing is also supported. If any of you are feeling like doing so, if you want to know a little bit more about this modem's design, you can look up that FCC ID at the FCC Office of Engineering and Technology Department. Here's the registration and ringer equivalence information, as well as a couple more regulatory approvals. And I'm wondering if maybe this modem would not have been a little bit ahead of its time, because this one chip that's sitting back here that's marked SSI, I have no idea who they were, only that their name appears on these house-numbered integrated circuits. This looks very much like some sort of a ROM, maybe even a flashable ROM. Again, it would have been very early days for such a thing. But maybe this modem was unusual in that it could have its capabilities extended by simply loading new microcode into the flash ROM. I don't know for sure. Of course, sometimes you can run into the most interesting people on the internet, and maybe the designer of this modem is still out there. Made in the USA. Again, you wouldn't see that today. It'd be very, very rare. But the thing I really want to get into down here is the logic board itself, just to see what kind of microprocessor this thing does in fact base upon, and just how severe the damage really runs, although it looks like it makes it to at least this header connector down here. It looks like it's pretty heavily corroded as well. And this, folks, is why you don't eat or drink near a laptop computer, especially if you're in a place where the food or the drink can be easily upset and ultimately spilled into the machine, because it will be the end of the road. Boy, some tools that I don't use very often are really getting a workout tonight. I've continued to take this thing apart, and I found something very interesting. Once I disconnected this very stiff ribbon cable, this little sheet of paper allowed me to pull this board out. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is the entirety of the computer's DC to DC converter. Also likely the battery charging controller circuit. And it looks to be undamaged. But I haven't actually gotten to the bottom of the motherboard just yet. Although I dare say that's probably not the CPU. I don't know where the CPU is hiding out on this board. But I did just answer the question about what platform this system bases upon. Looks like it's a 386SX, because that's the PLCC socket for a 387SX. And this is a CR2430 button battery. Kind of interesting to see that this machine uses a different standby memory retention battery that's separate from its clock battery. In fact, I'm curious about something. Just go ahead and pry this out of there. Oh, that's a good place for it, because I'm sure that works as a math coprocessor. Let's see if this thing's actually got any charge in it. Renata batteries are very high quality, but even then there's a limit as to the kind of miracles one can really pull off or expect to happen. I don't know how I'm going to do this, other than to think I'm so clever that I will do it. Alright, let's see if I can get this battery under test here. Yeah, this is kind of fiddly. No, it looks like it's just about completely flat to me. Just a couple millivolts hanging on there. So that battery is definitely done. I'll go ahead and do a very informal test. Just to see if it is indeed dead, and it is. Looks like it either started to leak or maybe it had some of whatever effluent was spilled into this machine. Start to damage it as well. Not really sure what's involved in getting the motherboard out of here, and unfortunately the service manual that I found doesn't have any lovely pictures in it to make my day any easier. Here's the first half of the machine's logic board assembly after I got it out of the metal enclosure. It took just a couple of minutes worth of diddling around to figure it out. Probably the most interesting component on here is this large Intel chip, and no, that is not the microprocessor. I was able to scare up a data sheet for this, and it turns out that in addition to being a cache controller, it is also a complete PC set of I/O subsystems on a chip. ISA bus, serial port, parallel port, cache control, interrupt controller, system timer, basically everything you need to make a PC compatible computer integrated into one monolithic chip. And I do mean monolithic. This was probably the best the technology could give them at the time. The same thing continues to be done in PCs today as the trend has continued toward greater and greater integration of parts. It's just that it's on a much smaller scale by now. These two items are memory chips. I'm not sure what they're for. They don't look like cache memory. And then over here is another fairly large chip manufactured by National Semiconductor. This looks to be a house-numbered part, so I'm guessing it's some portion of the system's core logic, although I'm not sure exactly what it would be. There's also a little tiny Samsung RAM chip right there, and another item from Maxim Semiconductor, which I haven't looked up yet to see what it might be. And then, of course, here at long last is the microprocessor itself. And the funny thing about this is a 387SX Math coprocessor socket. Of that, I'm practically 100% certain. I don't think there was ever a version of the 387 or 387DX manufactured in this PLCC design. The funny thing about the i386SL, I always thought this was a full-fledged 386DX just with power-saving capabilities tacked onto it. Here's some memory on this board. This probably accounts for the base memory in the system before you add any via an expansion method. And yes, there is a memory expansion method available to this particular system. That's what this item that said Compaq on it turned out to be. This is a 4 megabyte memory card extended refresh, and I believe that this is intended to be used as random access memory, but I'm not 100% certain about that because this looks very much like a PCM-CIA connector on the end. And there were, back in the day, non-volatile memory cards manufactured that plugged into PC card slots and basically ended up working as a storage disk device. A precursor to a solid-state drive, if you will. But I don't think this is compatible with that. If this would even fit into a PC card slot, the result would probably be smoke and a dead card, maybe even a dead host. And as you can see, it was manufactured by Texas Instruments in Italy. The date codes are all over the place on this system, but some of that is potentially explained by the fact that this would likely have been an upgrade to the system's RAM. It was probably added later when the system's owner realized that they needed more memory to run their software appropriately. The date codes on most of the logic place this thing's date of manufacture around 1993. There's the 42nd week of 1992. What does this thing say? I don't see a date code on it. 9236. The modem, which we were looking at just a minute ago and which almost managed to escape, has again wildly different date codes on it from the beginning of 1992, which suggests that maybe Compaq was sitting on a stock of these and they used them across several different systems. It might also be suggested by the copyright date. Well, this was supposed to be a video about an old laptop power up, revival, that sort of thing. Unfortunately, it didn't turn out that way. But I think, ladies and gentlemen, that it's safe to say we had a heck of a good time tearing this thing down. And I don't know about you, but I certainly thought it was an interesting journey. And that journey has now concluded, so this is your tour guide, uxwbill, bringing the bus down to a stop, thanking you all for watching, and encouraging you to leave a comment if you have one. To my complete amazement, the battery actually seems like it might be trying to come up and take a charge, although I'm sure it's no good any longer.